So for the last few weeks, Drew has been talking to us about taking risks, and he challenged everyone on staff to take 2 risks this year. Now, for me, when I hear the word risk, I get excited because I've always been someone who loves to take risks. I love the unknown result and what makes it risky, and I have just always loved jumping into that stuff. I've always been a little bit of an adrenaline junkie, so I love trying new things, even when I don't know what the outcome is going to be. And my mom always said when I was growing up that the phrase, if your friend jumps off the bridge first, are you going to jump in after them, never applied to me because I'd be the friend jumping off the bridge first. So I was talking to some people who don't like taking risks, and I was like, okay, why don't you like taking risks? Why isn't this something you enjoy doing? And one of the most common answers was, I am afraid to fail. So I want to take a look at a Bible story today that kind of teaches us what happens when our risks fail. So today we're going to be looking at Matthew 14:22 through 33, and this is most commonly known as Jesus walks on water. So to kind of recap this story, this happened right after Jesus fed the 5,000. So right after all of that, he put the 12 disciples on a boat and he went to go to a mountain to pray by himself. Well, when he was done praying, he decided to return to the disciples, and by that time, the boat was already a significant distance from Jesus. So he walked on water. He walked right to them. The disciples, they were in disbelief. They were shocked, probably a little scared and terrified. And they looked at him and they said, "It's a ghost." But Jesus said in verse 27, "It is I." Peter's response to that in verse 28 is, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said in verse 29, "Come." And Peter walked. He walked on the water. He started walking toward Jesus. He got off the boat. Now, this seems like a great place to end the story. A couple of lessons that we learned from this are Peter was the only one to take that risk. It's not like all the disciples were lining up and saying like, "Oh no, Jesus, tell me to come instead," or, "Oh, Peter, I'm coming in right after you." Peter was the only one to step up and say like, "Jesus, if that's you, tell me to come to you on the water and I will." And that was an incredible risk. Peter displayed incredible faith in Jesus because walking on water, that wasn't something anyone did. You know, when you jump in the water, you go down, you don't walk. So he displayed incredible faith in Jesus in that moment. And I think it's important to remember that the context of this story, it's not midday where it's bright outside. And, you know, the weather, it's not a beautiful sunny day and the waters are calm. This happened around dawn. So it's kind of dark outside and it's very windy. So the waters are choppy. And yeah, so this was an incredible risk and display of faith we saw in Peter. And again, like I said, this would be a really nice place to end the story because it's like, oh man, Jesus did this miracle. Peter joined him. How cool, how nice. Like, you know, that's great. But this is not where the story ends. So we're going to look at what happens next. So starting in verse 30, Peter became afraid. And when he became afraid, he began to sink. And I think it's important to remember that this wasn't quicksand. Peter wasn't gradually, slowly going down. This was water. He was sinking like this. He went straight down. And he cried out to Jesus. Now, there's a number of reasons that Peter sank. He sank because he was full of doubt. He was full of fear. In that moment, he had little faith. And he was focusing on his surroundings. It says he was looking around at the wind and, you know, the waves were all choppy and stuff. He was focusing on his surroundings and everything around him instead of Jesus. So what happens after that? Okay, in verse 31, it said, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Jesus didn't wait. He didn't stand there and he didn't watch to see what would happen next. And he didn't let Peter drown. The word that stands out to me the most in verse 31 is immediately. Immediately, Jesus was right there reaching his hand out to catch him. He didn't just let him sink. He was immediately right there. And I think that's so important to remember. So there are a lot of lessons in risk-taking we can learn from this story. And the first one is Peter's failure equaled God's plan. This wasn't a shock to Jesus that Peter began to go underwater and he became afraid. He wasn't surprised. This was all part of God's plan. And I'm sure in that moment it was hard for Peter to see the bigger picture. But the bigger picture is something we see today. That's something like when we read this story, we get to learn from Peter's failure. The disciples learned from Peter's failure. The people that they went around and that they told about this learned from it. And so many years later, millions of people get to read this and learn from him. So when we fail, it may feel like in that moment, like, oh my goodness, like, why did this happen? But we don't always see the bigger picture. And sometimes that is because the people around us will learn from our failures and where we went wrong, or what we struggled with in that moment. People are going to learn from us. So the second lesson is this: the more risks we take, the easier they become, because our faith grows. Now, I'm sure after this day, the next time Peter had to take a leap of faith and take a risk, he did it a little bit more confidently, because he learned so much this day. And the more risks we take, the easier they become, because our faith in God grows, because we see how he's there for us through all of it. He's there for us through our failures, through our successes. Just like Jesus was immediately there for Peter, our faith grows through our failures and successes. Now, the third lesson we can learn is this: having complete faith in God through everything. When Peter was focused on Jesus, when that was his sole focus, what did he do? He stepped off the boat and he began to walk. He walked on water. But it wasn't until he started looking at his surroundings, he started looking at the wind and the waves, that he sunk. In that moment, he lost that faith and he began to go down. Now, the fourth lesson is God is still with us when we fail. He isn't just with us when we succeed and when we accomplish great things and in the happy times. He's with us in the tough times and when we fail. We can see this when Peter began to go down. Jesus didn't wait. He didn't sit back and just say, like, oh, I want to see what's going to happen, or he lost faith, so I'm going to watch him. No, he was immediately there reaching out his hand and pulling him up, just like God is immediately there for us through everything we go through. And in the happy times, but even in the failures, God is right there with us to pick us back up. So the fifth and final lesson we can learn from this is risks, they aren't always going to be comfortable, and they aren't always going to be safe. We like comfort. We like safety. We like being home. We like being with our comfort people, because it feels safe. We know what to expect, but risks aren't always going to be like that. Most risks, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. But most risks require us to take that leap of faith, to step out of the boat, to have our sole focus on Jesus and just trust in him and to trust in his plan.